I am Daniel Lee,
And this is Mick, the Dr. Original.
and welcome to Sex 101 and Relationship. And as our version for a new beginning, I'm inviting you to please do listen to our podcast, Music 101, because Mr. Mick and I, we talk about lots of new beginnings in terms of music. And of course, you are on Sex 101. And we are empowering, of course, sex and relationship. So, Mr. Mick, what we gonna talk about for today?
Well, as an introduction, this was entitled Do You Not Like Sex or Do You Just Not Like Patriarchal Sex? This is my reaction to a Substack article by Celeste Davis. I thought this would make a good introduction and in terms of an episode about Sex 101. So, in today's society, there are those who maintain that the concepts of patriarchal structures and gender norms is being challenged more than ever. While some may argue this shift is leading to a complete dismantling of traditional gender roles, others posit that simply a move towards a more equitable and inclusive society. This movement towards a more inclusive society is about the importance of gender identity and the practices that go with it. Specifically, the episode is about sexual practices and gender expectations. Advocates claim that by challenging patriarchal norms and expectations, we're opening up the possibility for individuals to define themselves in ways that are empowering and authentic to them. It's a rejection of the limitations and constraints that are imposed upon individuals based on their gender. In conclusion, the goal is to create a society where individuals are valued and respected for who they are, not for how well they conform to societal expectations.
So, Mr. Mick, what is the thesis of Davis' article?
She says, I quote, I wasn't saying no to sex with men. I was saying no to sex for men. And she asked the question, why do so many married straight women assume they don't like sex? Celeste's thesis arose from a point where she initially made and then did research among women to find out their ideas. One divorced friend discovered after the split that she was indeed interested in sex. That was that for a short time, but then a second buddy divorced, only to make the same discovery as their first acquaintance. Yet a third friend made the same point and pondered, just how common is this story? Why do so many married straight women not enjoy sex? Celeste went to the one place where she knew reliable research could be found, Instagram. And with an extensive sample of 3, she was ready to tell the world about what she had discovered. If you thought that perhaps I'm quite skeptical, you would indeed be correct. I'm not saying the points she is making were not apropos, but it does seem that she could have been more thorough. And I'm always a bit leery when a thinker posits an abstraction such as patriarchy and claims that it applies to a general and comprehensive view. All this from just talking to 3 women. Once I did an initial summary of the top 5 academic papers on patriarchal sex, this is what I found. There was patriarchal sexuality in Morocco, the comfort women's system in Japan, female teaching in Nepal helps girls, female narrators, and feminism in Saudi Arabian folktales, and an academic analysis of erotica and pornography for undergraduate students. The premise for the existence, excuse me, of patriarchal sex seems extraordinarily sketchy, but let's take Celeste at her word and see what her interviewers had to say. Whoops. Her first interview reports that a traditional upbringing in India resulted in the woman not wanting sex. As with the research, the Indian woman who confesses to having a problem with sex would indicate that patriarchy is so predominant as to be a universal phenomenon. Davis seems to be concerned with American or Western experience. Where can we actually find patriarchal sex? Is it confined to certain places or is it everywhere? This is the woman where Celeste got her money quote. Then she was like, you need to separate patriarchy from sex. Sex is not just for men, sex is for you. And I was like, that's it. I wasn't saying no to sex with men. I was saying no to sex for men. I was saying no to patriarchal sex, which was the only sex I knew. When asked specifically what was the catalyst to start liking sex, all three of her interviewers said some version of the same thing. I'm not sure how much we can do with this information. Maybe we just have three poor male lovers, nothing more. I would think the dissatisfaction with sex by women in marriage would be better attested to in order to draw relevant points about patriarchy in sex. Most of the concerns that women actually express are really understandable and not surprising. As summarized by Davis, all of them said that the thing that made sex not pleasurable was when sex was one, a duty, two, just for her partner. The anecdote was time and space just to herself, for herself to ponder and prioritize her own desires. None of this is surprising or patriarchal in nature. The same dissatisfaction with sex could apply to any sexual partner at any time. As it is no big deal, Celeste suggests in conclusion that the solution is to just start centering women's sexuality.
So, Mr. Mick, w- why is so hard to center women in heterosexual sex?
At first glance, the solution seems simple enough by prioritizing the woman's experience. Problem solved. Davis demurs, though, because there are so many barriers against prioritizing a woman's sexuality. And she says 300 could be mentioned, but she will only mention three. All right. One, the very definition of heterosexual sex is male penetration and orgasm. Celeste is wrong. The definition of heterosexual sex is not limited to male penetration and orgasm. Heterosexual sex refers to sexual activity between two people of different genders, typically a man and a woman, where they engage in sexual behaviors such as kissing, touching, and intimacy. In heterosexual sex, penetration can occur, but is not the only aspect of sexual activity. Other forms of sexual activity, such as oral sex, mutual masturbation, and other forms of intimacy, can also be considered part of heterosexual sex. It's important to note that sexual activity is a personal and individual experience, and what constitutes sexual activity can vary greatly from person to person or couple to couple. It's also important to recognize that the definition of sexual activity is not limited to penetration or orgasm. Sexual activity can include a wide range of behaviors. What Celeste does is she invokes Merriam Webster's definition of heterosexual sex as penetration of the vagina by the penis. However, the definition of heterosexual sex provided by Merriam Webster is limited to a specific type of sexual activity. It's important to recognize that sexuality is a complex and multifaceted aspect of human experience that cannot be reduced to a single definition or behavior. Selects makes a blanket statement that sex is defined in our court system as penetration by the penis. But courts do not universally define sex as penetration of the vagina by the penis. In fact, many courts have recognized that sex can take many forms and that penetration is not the only way to engage in sexual activity. For example, some courts have recognized that oral sex, anal sex, and other forms of sexual activity can be considered sex, even if they do not involve penetration. It's important to note that the definition of sex can vary depending on the jurisdiction and the specific legal context. For example, some states may have specific laws that define sex as penetration of the vagina by the penis, while others may have broader definitions that include other forms of sexual activity. The mistake that Davis makes is that she alone defines sex as penetration by a penis, whereas many people do not, in particular women or even in the courts. It's certainly true that men need more education, and it's to recognize a woman's pleasure. A penis is less important than fingers and tongue, but it's a logical misstep to blame male inadequacy as patriarchal. A woman should communicate to her male partner that the clitoris is an essential component for the vast majority of women to feel pleasured enough to orgasm. There is a female echo chamber that rails about patriarchy, but I think they're complicating the issue between couples. It seems to me that good communication, emotional connection, and intimacy can go a long way to solving sexual dysfunction. There's really no evidence for Celeste's contention that sex for couples is only complete with male orgasm and penetration. Male pleasure is not the goal for all couples everywhere, as she suggests. Two, female arousal is bypassed. Davis simply says sex in our culture is deeply ingrained as for the man, but that unfortunately, natural lubrication is often ignored or rushed in favor of commercial lubricant. This too is a point she simply lifts from a female echo chamber. This is all circular reasoning. 3, the fun part of sex is for men. The not fun consequences are for women. There's this standard canard about pregnancy, and that is entirely the woman's responsibility to deal with the consequences of a male's orgasm. However, based on some research studies, here's some general findings. A study published in the Journal of Marriage and Family found that among unmarried couples, about 60% of men reported wanting to be involved with the mother of their child. Another study published in the Journal of Family Issues found that among unmarried fathers, about 55% reported wanting to be involved with the mother of their child. A study published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships found that among unmarried couples, about 50% of the men reported wanting to be involved with the mother of their child. In summary, 50 to 60% of unmarried men wanted to be a part of the woman's birth experience. That seems like a reasonable percentage, since in many ways, the couple may not realistically have the maturity, long term relationships, or even the financial means to support the impregnated woman. The percentage of responsible men for pregnancy clearly increases when they are, in fact, older, are in a committed relationship, and can afford childcare. This is a question of whom between men and women takes responsibility to use pregnancy prevention methods. A study published in the Journal of Sex Research found that among men aged 18 to 24, about 60% reported using a condom during their last sexual encounter. Another study published in the Journal of Adolescent Health found that among women aged 15 to 19, about 70% reported using a condom during their last sexual encounter, while about 30% reported not using a condom. A published study in the Journal of Family Planning and Reproductive Health Care found that among men aged 25 to 34, about 50% reported using a condom during their last sexual encounter. Another study published in the Journal of Women's Health found that among women aged 25 to 34, about 60% reported using a condom during their last sexual encounter. In summary, men use birth control methods 50 to 60% of the time, whereas women do 60 to 70% of the time. There is a statistical difference, but once again, men seem quite responsive to the danger of an unplanned pregnancy by a woman. In conclusion, Celeste seems unduly harsh in her views against men.
Very well said, Mr. Nick. Very well said. So, is the picture even worse for married women?
Well, not to be outdone, Davis then focuses on married women. In Celeste's view of history, it's difficult for married women not to be swept along in the swift current of hundreds of years of marriage norms. While rape was considered a crime in this country as early as the 1700s, marital rape was considered a crime only in the 1970s and the 1980s, and then in all 50 states by 1993. Although this is recent and regrettable, it's also due to the difficulty of reporting, investigating, and prosecuting such a private and complex crime. Even in the case of the statistics about entitlement to sex, the figures can be obscure. I don't think they're evidence of patriarchy at all. 59% of husbands thought they were entitled to sex, but that statistic says nothing about rape. And I think we have to drill down to understand what permitting sex is. I would think that women as well as men feel as though they're entitled to sex during marriage. The goal of most couples for both genders is the enjoyment of sexual satisfaction. As a result, both men and women feel as though they are entitled to sex. Davis then makes an illogical leap that 59% statistic means that a man holds some ownership over his wife and her body. In conclusion, she claims that we are not that far off from a time when men literally owned their wives as property.
So, did husband legally own their wives as property for the past 3 centuries?
Celeste considers that marital rape is not offensive, and she points to the historical leftovers of coverture laws. Coverture was a legal doctrine that was prevalent in many common law countries, including the United States from the 17th to the 19th centuries. It held that a married woman's legal identity and autonomy were subsumed by her husband's and that she was considered to be under his cover or protection. Under coverture, a married woman was not considered to be a separate legal entity, but rather an extension of her husband. She was not allowed to own property, enter into contracts, or sue or be sued in her own name. Her husband was considered to be her legal representative, and all her property and assets were considered to be his. Coverture was based on the idea that marriage was a union of two people and that the husband was the head of the household. It was seen as a way to protect women and ensure their well being, but in reality, it often had the opposite effect. It limited women's ability to make decisions, own property, and control their own lives. Coverture was gradually abolished in many countries, including the United States, in the late 19th and early 20th century. The Married Women's Property Acts, which were passed in many states, gave married women the right to own property and enter into contracts in their own name. The doctrine of coverture was officially abolished in the United States with the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920, which granted women the right to vote. Davis mistakenly states that coverture ended only in the past few decades. Celeste comments, it is shocking how recent coverture laws were still in effect. A woman couldn't own her property without a man until 1974. She couldn't get a loan for a business without a man until 1988, and she couldn't get a credit card in her name until 1974. While it's true that women's property rights were limited in many ways throughout history, the idea that a woman could not own her own property without a man until 1974 is an oversimplification. For example, the first Married Women's Property Act was passed in New York in 1848, allowing married women to own and control their own property. And similar laws were passed in other states, including Massachusetts, 1849, Michigan, 1850, California, 1852. By the early 20th century, most states had passed laws giving married women greater property rights, although there were still some limitations. For example, some states required a husband's consent for a wife to sell or mortgage property, or allowed a husband to control a wife's property if he was deemed to be head of the household. It wasn't until the 1970s and 1980s that many states passed laws to further equalize property rights between men and women. For example, the Uniform Marriage and Divorce Act, which was adopted by many states in the 1970s, provided that property acquired during marriage would be divided equally between spouses in the event of the divorce. In 1974, the California Supreme Court ruled in the case of Marvin v. Marvin that a married woman had a right to own and control her own property, regardless of her husband's consent. This decision was significant because it established a precedent for other states and helped further to erode the doctrine of coverture. Also, women could get a loan. Women have been able to get loans for businesses without a man's signature or involvement for many decades. In the United States, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed in 1974, which provided lenders from discriminating against borrowers based on their gender, race, religion, national origin, or marital status. This act also required lenders to consider a borrower's credit worthiness and ability to repay the loan rather than their gender or marital status. Prior to this, women often faced significant barriers to accessing credit, including the requirement that a woman's husband sign a loan or guarantee the loan. However, this helped to eliminate barriers and pave the way for women to access credit on their own terms. In the 1980s, the Small Business Administration also took steps to promote women's entrepreneurship and access to capital. The Women's Business Centers were established in 1989 to provide training, counseling, and access to credit for women entrepreneurs. In addition, many private lenders and financial institutions began to offer credit products specifically designed for women entrepreneurs, such as women-focused small business loans and credit cards. Therefore, it's not accurate to say that a woman couldn't get a loan for a business without a man until 1988. Women have had access to credit and capital for decades, and the barriers to accessing credit have been steadily eroding over time. The statement that a woman couldn't get a credit card in her own name until 1974 is incorrect. While it's true that women's access to credit cards was limited in the past, the idea that a woman couldn't get a credit card in her name until 1974 is an oversimplification. In the United States, credit cards were first introduced in the 1920s. and they were initially marketed primarily to men. However, women were able to obtain credit cards in their own names from the early days of credit card history. For example, the Diners Club card, which was introduced in 1946, was available to women from the beginning. The American Express card, which was introduced in 1958, also allowed women to apply for cards in their own names. However, it's true that women's access to credit cards was often limited by the credit scoring system, which was biased towards men. The credit scoring system, which was developed in the 1950s and 1960s, was based on factors such as income, employment history, and credit history, which was often more readily available for men than for women. It wasn't until the 1970s and 80s that credit card companies began to actively market credit cards to women and to develop credit scoring systems that were more inclusive of women's financial experiences. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which was passed in 74, also helped to eliminate discrimination against women in credit transactions. Therefore, while it is true that women's access to credit cards was limited in the past, the idea that a woman couldn't get a credit card in her own name until 1974 is an oversimplification. Women have been able to obtain credit cards in their own names for many decades, and the barriers to accessing credit have steadily eroded over time. Historically, women have been restricted, but there's been tremendous progress, and simply throwing historical limitations against men is really uncalled for. There's no question women have had a difficult time in many instances, and just as true historically, there have been significant and exceptional women who excelled. I'm more of the opinion that both genders need to learn how to submit to one another. It seems more likely to obtain a loving, emotionally connected relationship. In conclusion, this is a helpful strategy and accords well with biblical principles, which, of course, we've covered in earlier episodes.
But Mr. Mick,
Yeah.
is it not centering women during sex just as unfair as centering men?
Well, Celeste has sketchy premises to build her argument on, but it's a fair question to advocate centering women. Davis evokes an historical textbook and its lack of mentioning that women can vote. This is too thin, though, to create a stronger argument about restrictions concerning women. If you were a young man born 20 years ago and noticed lots of let's empower women messages without understanding why those messages are necessary, of course, you would think this is terribly unfair to empower women. What about the men, you would ask? And in terms of sex, instead of understanding what makes sex so unenjoyable for so many women, it would be easy to blame the woman and wonder, what's wrong with you? Patriarchy and men are not synonyms. There would have to be quite a bit of documentation needed to establish patriarchy as a problem in sex. Nothing Celeste has done has demonstrated she's shown that. Davis states that the author of Genesis claimed women were responsible for all of humanity's sins, i.e., patriarchy. I think there's some misinformation here. In the biblical book of Genesis, specifically in chapter 3, it is not women who are held responsible for all of humanity's sins. Instead, in the story of Adam and Eve, the first humans created by God, that is told. According to the biblical account, Adam and Eve disobeyed God's command not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and as a result, they sin. This sin is often referred to as the original sin, as seen as the source of humanity's separation from God. In this story, both Adam and Eve are held accountable for their actions, and their sin is not attributed solely to Eve. In fact, the biblical text says that Adam was with Eve when she ate the fruit, and that he also ate from the tree, Genesis 3:6. It's important to note that the biblical account is not simplistic or a patriarchal view of women as solely responsible for humanity's sins. Rather, it presents a complex and nuanced story of human nature, sin, and redemption. In Christian theology, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is often seen as the counterbalance to the story of Adam and Eve. While Adam and Eve's disobedience led to humanity's separation from God, Mary's obedience and faithfulness to God's will are seen as a model of redemption. As the mother of Jesus, Mary is often referred to as the new Eve or the mother of the Redeemer, emphasizing her role in bringing about salvation through her son. In this sense, Mary's yes to God's will, as recorded in the Gospel of Luke, is seen as a reversal of Eve's no to God's command in the Garden of Eden. In conclusion, Mary's obedience and faithfulness as a woman is seen as offsetting the effects of Adam and Eve's disobedience, and her role in the incarnation of Jesus is seen as a way of restoring humanity's relationship with God.
Yes. Very well said, Mr. Mitch. Very well said. So thus, good sex for women mean wait, good sex for men. So
Good sex.
yeah, does good sex for women mean good sex for men?
Let's hope so. Celeste produces evidence that most men want to please their partners. I think most men really do want to please their partners. Many men display qualities essential to intimacy, like vulnerability and emotional connection. Oddly, instead of quoting a representative man, Celeste invokes bell hooks to speak for men, stating they get emotional satisfaction from sex. Hooks was an American author, theorist, educator, and social critic who was best known for her writings on race, feminism, and class. How would a woman know that exactly? Is that woman splaining? I don't think it's controversial to state, as Celeste helpfully explains, in conclusion, a better sexual experience for the woman means a better sexual experience for the man.
Definitely, totally agree, I think. So, what does patriarchal heterosexual sex even look like?
So, if you're thinking of non patriarchal heterosexual sex, I think this is far more common than Davis recognizes or is willing to admit. Having sex for many couples means massages, cunnilingus, clitoral stimulation, or orgasm for both genders, often with or without penetration. Female organism and male orgasm can be equally valued and sought after. So, both organisms are probably the goal for both, but there would never be any pressure to achieve either. Climax can be dethroned as the ultimate sign of successful sex, replaced by intimate adoration of the other person. Because love is the goal, everyone's desires matter immensely. Checking in to make sure your partner, whether male or female, is feeling heard and attended to should be the norm. Women should feel equal freedom to be the desirer rather than merely the desired. You should be deemed worthy of the desirability simply because you are you. There should be no pressure to perform, only to be present, only to enjoy, only to have fun, only to rejoice in each other and yourself. So here's some pointers about sex that can be satisfying to both men and women. Communication is key. Talk to your partner about both what you want and need in the bedroom. This can help both feel more comfortable and satisfied. Two, pay attention to each other's bodies. Take the time to explore each other's bodies and find out what feels good. This can help you feel both more connected and satisfied. Three, don't focus solely on penetration. While penetration can be a part of sex, it's not the only thing that matters. Focus on other forms of intimacy, such as kissing, touching, and oral sex. Four, take your time. Don't rush through sex. Take your time and enjoy the experience. This can help both feel more relaxed and satisfied. Five, experiment with different positions. Try out different positions to find out works best for both of you. This can help you both feel more comfortable and satisfied. Six, don't be afraid to ask for what you want. If there's something specific you want to try or something that feels uncomfortable, don't be afraid to talk to your partner. Communication is key in the bedroom. Seven, focus on pleasure, not performance. Instead of focusing on performance, focus on pleasure. This can help both feel more relaxed and satisfied. Eight, don't forget about foreplay. Foreplay is an important part of sex. Take the time to kiss, touch, and explore each other's bodies before moving on to, or even if you want penetration. Nine, be open to new things. Don't be afraid to try new things in the bedroom. This can help you feel both excited and satisfied. And last but not least, 10, prioritize intimacy. While sex is an important part of a relationship, intimacy is just as important. Make sure to prioritize intimacy and connection in your relationship. Remember, sex is both a personal and intimate experience, and what works for one couple may not work for another. The most important thing is to communicate with your partner and find out what works best for both of you to be intimate.
Yes, trial and error, people. Mr. Mick, very well said. Thank you so much for those insights. I
Thank
hope our
you.
listeners will empower. And patriarchal sex, as Mr. Mick saying, refers to sexual dynamics and norms influenced by patriarchal systems, where male dominance and control shape attitudes, behaviors, and expectations surrounding sexuality. So, people, Sex 101, another great episode, and for year 2025, Mr. Mick and I preparing you the best tips and more empowering episodes. So, Mr. Mick, what will be your hope for Sex 101 for the year 2025?
Good health, good success, and more intimacy and more closeness. That's what we all need. We need love.
Yes, very well said. So, Mr. Mick, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel. Day is well.
More to come, people. See you soon. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Mick. Another great episode.